on, YESHUA was having a discussion with religious Jews who they knew they were to follow the Torah, believed they were following the Torah, but they wasn't quite sure about who YESHUA was. And so YESHUA gave this answer to them in John in chapter 5 and verse 39. He said, "Search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and they are they which testify of me." The scriptures testifies of YESHUA. And then he said in John chapter 5, verses 46 and 47, "For had you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me." YESHUA said that Moses, or the Torah, is written about him. And then he says, "But if you believe not his writings." Well, how is YESHUA stating that they don't believe his writings? Because that's how they express their faith, by believing in the Torah, following the Torah. But he says, but if you believe not his writings, he's saying that the Torah speaks of him. And so if you're following the Torah, or think you're following the Torah, and don't understand and see how the Torah speaks or written about YESHUA, you're really not following the Torah. "But if you believe not his writings, then how will you believe my words?" That in order to understand YESHUA's ministry, YESHUA's teachings, and YESHUA's words, you need to understand the Torah, and you need to understand and see him in the Torah. And that is what we're going to be doing today in this seminar. We're going to be understanding how these things are so. And because when the question was asked, so many of you, the vast majority of you, put up your hands and said that you've heard me speak before. If I had a new audience, I would probably say a few things differently. But since most of you have heard me speak before, then that allows me in certain instances to share a little differently. And so that brings me to the thought of what I want to share right now. And this is my personal observation, analysis, belief, is in the book of Acts, chapter 3, in verse 21, it says, "Whom the heavens must receive until the times of restitution," or you might say restoration of all things. The Bible prophesies that there's going to be a restoration of all things. And so part of the restoration of all things is the restoration of the name, the sacred name, Yod, He, Vav, He, commonly pronounced and referred to as Yahweh. Now, number of years ago, I was reading Orthodox Jewish commentary from a rabbi who lives in Jerusalem now. And he stated the following. He said that Jews not saying the sacred name is only something that is associated with exile. And that once the redemption comes, that is, the unification of the 12 tribes of Israel, Messiah ruling and reigning over the 12 tribes of Israel, the Torah going forth from Jerusalem, commonly called the Messianic era, that the whole world will use the name and say the name, that there's a restoration of the name. Now that is from Orthodox Jewish sources. And then a few years after that, I was reading a book, From Exile to Redemption, I believe was the book, by Rebbe Menachem Schneerson, and he stated the same thing, that even in Orthodox Jewish thought, the restoration of the name is a part of the restoration of all things. And so I believe in the restoration of all things. So therefore, I believe that there's a restoration of the name. And so within this movement, there has been an effort to have that the restoration of the name is a part of the restoration of other things that we are walking in. But my analysis of the practical reality of it is that the majority of people aren't mature enough to walk in the restoration of the name, because when they say the name Yahweh, they think in their minds God the Father. And when they say Yahweh all the time, and they think of God the Father, they begin the process of throwing Yeshua aside when they use the name Yahweh. But even though Yeshua is Yahweh, and if we were mature enough to use the name and understand that Yeshua is Yahweh at the same time, then we're going down the right path. But when we say the name and think of the Father, and it causes us to put Yeshua aside when in the volume of the book it's written of him, then it's not helpful in practical reality. And so because of that, I have been toning down a little bit, the use of the name. And so I don't not use it because it's valid as a part of the restoration of all things. But rather than saying it 100% of the time, if it's going to cause people to think God the Father and throw Yeshua aside, then it's defeating the purpose because we're not mature enough. And so as a result, I like to say God of Israel. I like to say Yahweh. When I am I'm speaking and sharing. And I like to say Yahweh to show that I do believe in the restoration of the name, but I don't like to do it 100% of the time because I've witnessed that people are not mature enough to understand what the name means. And so now let's look at Yeshua from Genesis to Revelation. And in the minds of most Christians, when you're reading, for example, Genesis 1:1, which says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And the word God there in Hebrew is Elohim. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. Well, we write in our minds and think of our minds when we read those words, God the Father. The irony is that we have several explicit verses in the New Testament. The first one being John in chapter 1 in verse 3 that says, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made, referring to Yeshua, because John 1:1, John 1:2 says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. So it's talking about Yeshua. And then it says about him, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And then in Colossians, Paul writes the following. In Colossians, in chapter 1, verse 15 and 16, it says, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. So speaking about Yeshua, it now says in Colossians 1:16, for by him were all things created, that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. So we're explicitly told in the New Testament that Yeshua created the heavens and the earth. In truth, it happened this way, that the heavens and the earth was willed to be created by God the Father. He willed it. But the Father doesn't execute his will. The Son executes the Father's will. So the Father wanted the heavens and the earth to be created. In other words, Yeshua is not allowed to create the heavens and the earth on his own. he gets direction from the Father. The Father says, I want it done. So YESHUA then spoke the world into existence. He's the one that said, let there be light. And then the Spirit of God took the spoken words of YESHUA, and what came about was this physical world that we see. So they all work together. The Father willed it, YESHUA spoke it, and the Spirit of God hovered and took the spoken words and completed the task. YESHUA, by speaking the world into existence, created the world, and it was all made for him. The next thing we want to see is that YESHUA is the one that made covenant with Abraham. We can see this from Galatians chapter 3, verse 16 and Galatians chapter 3, verse 29. And in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16, Paul is quoting from Genesis chapter 17, verse 7. So we'll read that. Genesis 17:7. It says, and I will establish my covenant between me and thee and your seed after you in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto you and to your seed after you. So now we look at Galatians in chapter 3 and verse 16. It says, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He says not seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, which is Messiah. To Abraham and Messiah were the promises made. He didn't say seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, which is Messiah. Now, Galatians chapter 3, verse 29 says, if you are Messiahs, then are you Abraham's seed and an heir according to the promise. In Messiah, you are an heir of what was promised to Abraham. Well, what if you're not physically descended from Abraham? How are you an heir of what was promised to Abraham if perhaps you are not a physical descendant of Abraham? Well, the verse says it's through Messiah. When you accept YESHUA as your personal Lord and Savior, you are in covenant relationship with him. And that covenant that you have made with him is the new covenant. You're in a new covenant relationship with YESHUA. So by believing that he is the Messiah, you are in covenant relationship with him. And he is in covenant relationship with Abraham. Because you're in covenant relationship with YESHUA, you are also in covenant relationship with everyone and everything that he's in covenant relationship with. And he's in covenant relationship with Abraham, so therefore, through YESHUA, you are an heir of the covenant promises that was made with Abraham. And a primary promise was that Abraham's descendants was promised a land. And that land was from the Nile to the Euphrates, as we can see in Genesis in chapter 15. So, by being believers in YESHUA as Messiah, you are an heir of what was promised to Abraham. And one of the primary things that was promised was a land. So, in YESHUA, you are an heir of the land. And how many believers in YESHUA as the Messiah in traditional Christianity have in their mindset, I can't wait to the day that I get to inherit the promised land that he has given to me in the covenant. We're thinking about, we go to heaven and the promised land is for them. You know, we have evangelical Christianity who knows and understands that I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you. and knows that the land of Israel is special, the city of Jerusalem is special, knows that you're supposed to love the Jewish people. And so they do. They have a fervent love. Evangelical Christian Zionists have a fervent love for Jewish people and the land of Israel and Jerusalem, and wants to love and support Israel and the Jewish people any way they can. But they don't personally see that promise of a land is to them. They're blessing the Jews because God bless you. And, you know, the irony about that is when you talk about believing in Yeshua and following the Torah, what's one of the first things that's got to come out of the mouth of a traditional Christian, even an evangelical Christian? But it says in Galatians. Well, if they know Galatians so well, why don't they know Galatians 3:29? That says, if you are Messiahs, then you Abraham's seed and heir according to promise. So that land was promised to them and also to us. And we need to realize and understand that. So how is it that they don't have the connection? How is it that evangelical Christian Zionists don't have the connection? Because they don't know who Yeshua is. They don't see that He's the one that made covenant with Abraham. They say it's God the Father that made covenant with Abraham, and He made that covenant with them. And, you know, that part of the book of the Bible is about them. And so God bless them. We acknowledge, you know, what happened there, but we're on a different path. In other words, they don't see Yeshua from Genesis to Revelation. Yeshua created the heavens and the earth. Yeshua made covenant with Abraham. Is everyone with me seeing that Yeshua made covenant with Abraham? Is everyone with me? They can see that? All right, if that's the case, now let's go to Genesis in chapter 15 and verse 17. It's describing when the one that's making covenant with Abraham. It's telling us what's happening. In Genesis chapter 15 verse 17 it says, and it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp between the pieces. The one that's making covenant with Abraham is described in making the covenant as a smoking furnace. That's describing Yeshua, right? So now we go, and let's cross-reference this with Exodus in chapter 19 and verse 18, where it says, and Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace. The one that's at Mount Sinai, the one that's going to be given the Torah, the one that is giving the Ten Commandments, the one that's speaking to Moses, his presence is described as a smoky furnace. Therefore, the one that made covenant with Abraham is the one that's given the Torah at Mount Sinai. Now, let me ask you a question. And the reason why I'm doing it is because it's a Hebraic way of teaching. Yeshua often taught by asking a question. When I ask this question, I expect that 100% of the people in here know the question. So are you ready? The question is, who is the one that saves? Yeshua is the one that saves. Will you agree with me on that? Because that's a very important point. Yeshua saves. All right, if we agree that Yeshua saves, now let's look at James in chapter 4 and verse 12. James chapter 4 verse 12 says, there is one lawgiver who is able to save. The one that is able to save know the question is the lawgiver. So are you ready? So if you just agree with me that Yeshua saves, who is the one that saves? The one that saves is the lawgiver. Yeshua is the one that saves. Will you agree with me on that? Because that's a very important point. Yeshua saves. All right, if we agree that Yeshua saves, now let's look at James in chapter 4 in verse 12. James chapter 4 verse 12 says, there is one lawgiver who is able to save. The one that is able in here know the question. So are you ready? The question is, who is the one that saves? Yeshua is the one that saves. Will you agree with me on that? Because that's a very important point. Yeshua saves. All right, if we agree that Yeshua saves, now let's look at James in chapter 4 in verse 12. James chapter 4 verse 12 says, there is one lawgiver who is able to save. The mediator of the new covenant. The one that is able in here know the question. So are you ready? The question is, who is the one that saves? Yeshua is the one that saves. What is this talking about? Whose voice shook the whole earth? What happened at Mount Sinai? Whose voice shook the whole earth? Yeshua, the mediator of a new covenant. Whose voice then shook the whole earth? So we can see here, once again, that Yeshua gave the Torah at Mount Sinai. Now let's look at another reference. John chapter 14 and verse 15. Yeshua said, if you love me, keep my commandments. When he said, if you love me, keep my commandments, he was making a reference to the very first place in the Bible where you see the phrase, love me and keep my commandments. Do you know where the very first place in the Bible where that phrase occurs? It's in Exodus chapter 20. And Exodus chapter 20 is the chapter on the giving of the 10 commandments. And Exodus chapter 20 verse 6, it says, showing mercy to thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Now, to a Jewish mind, the way you're supposed to learn the scriptures is the following. You're supposed to know the scriptures so well that if I just make a little hint to something, you know what I'm talking about. And not only do you know what I'm talking about, you know all the things related and associated to that hint or that thought. So when he said, if you love me, keep my commandments, his audience was to know the scripture so well that they know that that phrase is in Exodus chapter 20. So by reference, his audience is going to understand that he is saying that he's the lawgiver. Because he said, keep my commandments. Keep my commandments. Commandments. What commandments? The Torah. If you love me, keep my commandments. Keep the Torah. Well, by seeing that he's referring to Exodus chapter 20 verse 6, then what is in Exodus chapter 20 also relates and is associated with the connection that he's making. You see that? So in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 2, it says, I am the Lord your God which brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So the one that said, showing mercy to thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments, the one that says, I show mercy to those that keep my commandments, is the one that brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. And the one speaking those words is also Yahweh Elohim. So when Yeshua said, if you love me, keep my commandments, he was saying as well, not only that he's the lawgiver, he's saying that he brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, and he's saying that he's Yahweh Elohim. By reference. Well, we have an explicit statement by Paul in 1 Corinthians in chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, that Yeshua was the one that was with the children of Israel in the wilderness. He was the rock. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1, it says, "Moreover, brethren, I would not that you be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. And they were all immersed under Moses in the cloud and in the sea." It's talking about the historical have an explicit statement here by Paul that the rock that was with the children of Israel in the wilderness, that rock was Messiah. He's the rock. He's Yahweh Elohim that brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. Well, let's see how Pharaoh and his army drowned in the Red Sea. In Exodus chapter 15, in verse 4, it talks about Pharaoh and his army drowning in the Red Sea. And then it says in verse 6 how it happened. It says, this is Exodus 15, verse 6, "Your right hand, O Lord, is become glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, has dashed in pieces the enemy." Who defeated Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea? It was the right hand. Well, who is the right hand? It is YESHUA. So YESHUA created the heavens and the earth. YESHUA made covenant with Abraham. YESHUA led the children of Israel out of Egypt. YESHUA defeated Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. YESHUA was the rock that was in the wilderness. YESHUA is the lawgiver. Are you seeing the pattern here? Okay, so now we go to Exodus in chapter 13 and verse 21. It says, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud to lead them by the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light to go by day and night." So the cloudy pillar is the Lord's presence. So who is this Lord that's leading the children of Israel out of Egypt? Well, we know it's the text is Yahweh, but who is it? It's YESHUA. YESHUA